Hi everyone and welcome to Truth Over News. Precise determination of the starting date for the COVID pandemic, or more importantly, the actual date at which the virus leaked from a Wuhan lab, is proving critical to understanding surrounding events that transpired in the last 4 months of 2019, events that repeatedly involved Anthony Fauci. As we'll explain, we've always argued that the lab leak happened much earlier than has been formally acknowledged. Most government and media narratives claim that COVID began circulating in either late November or December 2019, but there's a big problem with these dates. A variety of reports strongly indicate that the virus was already spreading throughout Wuhan in October 2019, which means that the virus probably escaped from a lab no later than early September and perhaps as early as August. This earlier timing is critical as it provides an entirely new perspective to events that would follow and raises a host of disturbing questions in the process. Early on in our investigations into the pandemic, as we were doing our research for our first big timeline and subsequent infographic, we came across a little seen article in a State Department magazine from Russell Westergaard, the U.S. Consul General in Wuhan. Westergaard described the situation they were facing on the ground, stating that by mid-October 2019, the U.S. consulate in Wuhan knew that the city had been struck by what was thought to be an unusually vicious flu season, and he noted that the disease worsened in November. Westergaard said that when Wuhan city officials began to close public schools in mid-December, his team passed the information to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing while they continued to monitor the situation. But it wasn't just Westergaard who saw evidence of an earlier outbreak. We also came across results from a Harvard Medical School study, which showed a marked increase in traffic at hospitals throughout Wuhan that took place in the fall of 2019. John Brownstein, the Harvard medical professor who led the research, wrote that something was happening in October. Clearly, there was some level of social disruption taking place well before what was previously identified as the start of the novel coronavirus pandemic. Brownstein said that his team studied commercial satellite images of 5 Wuhan hospitals and observed a dramatic increase in hospital traffic beginning in late summer and early fall 2019. He also noted that this observance coincided with an increase in Chinese internet searches for symptoms later linked to COVID-19. Government and corporate media narratives aside, it seems apparent that by early October 2019, COVID was in relatively wide circulation throughout Wuhan. This led us to believe that the actual leak of COVID from a lab likely happened sometime in early September or even more likely in August, as there would have had to been some natural lead time for the virus to propagate throughout the city's population. We have another critical data point as well. On September 12, 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology's database of viral sequences was suddenly and inexplicably taken offline. The deleted database, which has never been publicly recovered, contained more than 22,000 unpublished samples and sequences of bat and rodent viruses. The deleted database contained crucial data and may well hold the key to determining whether the Wuhan lab had COVID-19 or a progenitor virus in its possession. Shi Zhengli, the director of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, later claimed that she deleted the database because of alleged hacking attempts, despite the fact that this information was supposed to be publicly available according to Daszak's funding agreement with Fauci's NIH. Despite the potential importance of the Wuhan Institute of Virology data, there have been no known requests from public health officials to reinstate or examine the Institute's database. Moreover, major health officials like Fauci, Francis Collins, and Jeremy Farrar, who were all involved in the pandemic response and the creation of the natural origin narrative, have never even publicly acknowledged the database's existence. In February 2021, the World Health Organization sent an investigative team to Wuhan. Their report states that as part of their analysis, they reviewed data collected through the China National Center for Bioinformation Integrated Database on all available coronavirus sequences. But the WHO's team inexplicably failed to request an examination of the Wuhan Institute's deleted database of viruses. Peter Daszak later claimed that the WHO's investigative team did not request to see the deleted Wuhan database because he told them that the data did not contain relevant information on the pandemic's origins. It's astonishing and completely unacceptable that the WHO would accept Daszak's overtly conflicted assertions at face value, rather than insisting upon examining the database for themselves.
In September 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology took online databases containing over 16,000 virus sequences and specimens offline, making them unavailable to scientists around the world. Dr. Shi has said they were taken offline because of a computer hack, but 15 months later, they are still unavailable. Did you ask to see these databases? Were they provided to you? And if not, why not? What was their answer? Peter.
I'll go first, Marion. Yeah, look, I asked the question in front of the whole team, both sides, while we're at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, about the so-called missing database. What we were told by Shi Jianli was that there'd been hacking attempts on it, about 3,000 hacking attempts, and they took down this Excel spreadsheet database. Absolutely reasonable. We did not ask to see the data. And as you know, a lot of this work is work that's being conducted with EcoHealth Alliance. I'm also part of those data, and we do basically know what's in those databases. I gave a talk to both sides about the work we've done with Wuhan Institute of Virology and explained what's there. There is no evidence of viruses closer to SARS-CoV-2 than RATG13 in those databases. Simple as that.
It seems fairly certain that COVID had already begun its spread throughout the city of Wuhan by October 2019. And as we've discussed, we think it's reasonable to believe that the original leak happened sometime in August or early September, before the Wuhan database was taken offline. But there's an intriguing twist to this timing. Robert Kadlec, who served as Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services during the pandemic, has blamed vaccine development as a likely cause for the outbreak. Kadlec points to the risky vaccine research on live animals conducted by Chinese military scientist Zhao Yushin, who was creating a vaccine for COVID-19 in October 2019. You heard that correctly. A vaccine for COVID was being created by China in October 2019. Yushin, who reportedly died in a mysterious fall from the roof of the Wuhan Institute in May 2020, filed a patent for COVID-19 vaccine in February 2020, just 5 weeks after China admitted there was human-to-human transmission of the virus. In other words, Kadlec, who may have his own concerns about timing, said that he believes the virus was accidentally leaked from a lab in either October or November 2019 from researchers who were already at work on a vaccine for COVID-19 while it was still in a lab. Now, it's true that there were multiple reports of 3 researchers becoming ill in November 2019. But the problem with this theory, as we've already discussed, is that it seems readily apparent that COVID was already well established in the Wuhan population by this same time. It's also unusual for top researchers to dedicate their time towards creating a vaccine for a virus that has zero exposure to the general population. We think a far more likely explanation for this series of strange events is the timing that we put forth earlier. The leak from the lab likely happened sometime in August or early September 2019, possibly even earlier than that, and efforts towards creating a vaccine were then hurriedly undertaken. It's probable that it was during the creation of the new vaccine that these 3 researchers fell ill. We're not alone in this hypothesis, and there are a number of virologists and scientists who believe a lab leak happened significantly earlier than has been acknowledged. Now, we've spent a fair amount of time presenting why we believe an earlier date for a lab leak is likely, but we've done so for some very specific reasons. On September 10, 2019, just 2 days before the Wuhan Institute suddenly deleted their virus database, Johns Hopkins published a study titled Preparedness for a High-Impact Respiratory Pathogen Pandemic. In other words, the perfect description of COVID. The report noted that novel high-impact respiratory pathogens have a combination of qualities that contribute to their potential to initiate a pandemic, making such an outbreak difficult to contain. The report also noted that new methods of containment would be required, with approaches different from those that have typically occurred in geographically limited events. The report warned that were a high-impact respiratory pathogen to emerge, either naturally or as the result of accidental or deliberate release, it would likely have significant public health, economic, social, and political consequences. The Hopkins report was commissioned by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, a WHO-related organization that included Anthony Fauci, Jeremy Farrar, Chris Elias, and Gao Fu among its 15 board members. As many already know, Fauci and Farrar co-organized the secret teleconference on February 1st that created the natural origin narrative. Dr. Elias is the president of global development for the Gates Foundation, and Gao Fu is the director of China's CDC. Notably, the Hopkins report cited mRNA vaccines as highly promising and potentially rapid vaccine development pathways, and recommended that mRNA vaccines should be pursued, funded, and fast-tracked in emergencies. Just 1 month later, on October 18th, and right as Zhao Yushin was working on his vaccine for COVID-19, Johns Hopkins partnered with the World Economic Forum and the Gates Foundation to host a training tabletop exercise they called Event 201. The group noted that it's only a matter of time before one of these epidemics becomes global, a pandemic with potentially catastrophic consequences. A severe pandemic which becomes Event 201 would require reliable cooperation among major industries, national governments, and key international institutions. Chris Elias from the Gates Foundation and China's Gao Fu were present for this event, along with Avril Haines, who is the former deputy director of the CIA, a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins, and Joe Biden's current director of national intelligence. The scenario used by Event 201 simulated an outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus transmitted from bats to pigs to people that eventually becomes efficiently transmissible from person to person, leading to a severe pandemic. Although the simulation closely paralleled the actual COVID pandemic, the group said the origin of their simulated outbreak was pig farms in Brazil instead of wild bats in China. Their selection of Brazil as a pandemic source is particularly odd because China is by far the largest pig producer in the world, with more than 450 million pigs produced per year. Brazil, by comparison, produces less than 10% of China's output at only 35 million pigs. One might suspect the Event 201 organizers intentionally avoided naming China as the more likely source of a pandemic. Regardless, the strange sequence of meetings continued. Roughly 2 weeks later, on October 31st, Fauci's NIAID held a SARS-CoV call. Although we don't know the NIAID participants, included in this call were EcoHealth President Peter Daszak, Ralph Baric, the godfather of gain-of-function experiments, and virologist Lin-Fa Wang, all three of whom were co-creators of the 2018 Diffuse proposal that was an outright blueprint for making COVID in a lab. There's one other item of note that we know took place in 2019. If you recall, the September 2019 Johns Hopkins report that was presented to the Global Preparedness Board placed a high emphasis on the development and use of mRNA vaccines, while simultaneously admitting that they have not yet broken through with licensed products. The Hopkins report overtly recommended that mRNA vaccines should be both pursued and funded. Now, as it turns out, sometime in late 2019, the CEO of Moderna, Stéphane Bancel, told his production team that they should prepare for a massive ramp-up in production, from 100,000 doses to 1 billion doses, because, quote, there's going to be a pandemic. Exactly how Bancel knew there would be a pandemic in late 2019 and a need to ramp up production from 100,000 doses to 1 billion doses has never been answered.
Moderna had made 100,000 doses in 2019 for the whole year. And I remember walking after Davos into the office of my head of manufacturing, and I say, how we make 1 billion doses next year? And he looked at me a bit funny, say, what? I say, yeah, we need to make 1 billion doses next year. There's going to be a pandemic.
On December 28, 2019, a Chinese scientist published the genetic profile of COVID on NIH's GenBank database, 2 weeks before China formally released the virus's sequence. Shockingly, NIH claimed the submission lacked certain technical information and the sequence was deleted. As a result, the COVID sequence remained hidden until January 11, 2020, when it was published by none other than proximal origin author Eddie Holmes. We know from a later admission by Holmes that he had the full sequence back on January 5th, but was instructed by China to wait until January 11th. The initial sequence deletion by NIH conveniently gave China the same delay they were demanding from Holmes. 2 days later, on January 13th, Fauci and Moderna quietly agreed to go ahead with manufacturing of the so-called mRNA COVID vaccines on a mass scale, despite later claims from Fauci that the risk from COVID was minuscule. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Truth Over News.